Let's notice Daniel chapter 9, verses 23 and 24. At the beginning of your supplications, the command went out, and I have come to tell you, for you are greatly beloved. Therefore, consider the matter and understand the vision. Understand the mareh. And that was what does Gabriel explain to Daniel? The 70 weeks. So are the 70 weeks instrumental in explaining the 2300 days? There's no way you can get around it. Now notice what verse 24 says. 70 weeks are determined for your people and your holy city. And then there are 6 things. To finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up, a better translation would be to bring to an end, vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. 6 things that were going to happen during the period of the 70-week prophecy. Once again, I need to underline this because it's so important. Does the prophecy of the 70 weeks have anything to do with understanding the prophecy of the 2300 days? Is there a connection and a link, yes or no? Absolutely. You can't get out of it. Because very, very clearly, Daniel does not understand. Gabriel explains the 70-week prophecy. Then Daniel says, now I understand. Now let me tell you something about that word determined that is used here. 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city. Now that word determined, this is the only time that it appears in the Old Testament. It's what theologians call a hax legomenon. In other words, it appears only once in the Hebrew Scriptures. Now, it's translated in different ways, determined, marked out, etc. But the basic meaning of the word Chathak is actually to cut off, to cut. Even though it's not used in other places of the Old Testament, it is used in the Mishnah. You know what the Mishnah is? It's a collection of Jewish traditions. And it's very ancient. And the word Chathak is used in the Mishnah. Let me explain how it's used there. Because it does help to understand how the Jews use terms. Even though it doesn't appear in the Bible, we know how they use these particular words. The word Chathak is used for cutting parts off of animals in the sacrificial service. It's used for cutting off the foreskin in circumcision. It's used to cut the wick of a lamp. It's used to cut ore out of a mountain. And it's also used to cut or divide the Bible into 2 parts. A verse that you're studying, divide it into 2 parts. In other words, the basic meaning of the word Chathak is to cut off. Now, of course, the big question is, when it says in Daniel 9 and verse 24, 70 weeks are cut off for your people and your city, the question is, cut off from where? Let me ask you this. When something is cut off, must it be cut off from something? Absolutely. For example, if you're going to cut a branch off of a tree, do you have to have a tree to cut the branch off of? Of course. So the 70 weeks are cut off. Where do you suppose the 70 weeks would be cut off from? They must be cut off from where? From the prophecy of the 2300 days. You see, the prophecy of the 2300 days is the longer portion of the prophecy. The 70 weeks, as we're going to study in our next 2 lectures, is the first portion that is cut off from the longer 2300-day period. Raise your hand if you're understanding what I'm saying. That's what the basic word means. It means to cut off. In other words, the 70 weeks are cut off from the longer prophecy of the 2,300 days. Now, basically, what I'm saying is that in Daniel chapter 9 and verse 2, Daniel is motivated to pray because of the desolation of Jerusalem. Whereas later on in Daniel chapter 9 and verse 25, Gabriel comes back and he says, listen, your prayer has been answered. Jerusalem will be restored after the 70 years. There will be a command to restore and to build Jerusalem at the end of the 70 weeks. But the 70 weeks are the first portion of the 2300-day prophecy. Now listen to what I'm going to say because it's very, very important. 70 weeks is symbolic language, isn't it? Because we're not talking about literal weeks, are we? We're talking about symbolic weeks. In other words, 70 weeks, and each week has how many days? Each week has 7 days. Are we talking about literal days, or are we talking about symbolic days? We're talking about symbolic days. You have to apply the year-day principle. And by the way, I know very few scholars who would say that the 70 weeks are to be taken literally. Because they know that the 70 weeks are really weeks of years. Even though the text does not say weeks of years, some translations translate weeks of years. Because they know that the 70-week prophecy is really a prophecy concerning 70 weeks of years. Now, if you multiply 70 times 7, 70 weeks times 7 days, how much do you come up with? You come up with 490. 490 days, right? Because they're 70 weeks. But those days represent what? Those days represent 490 years. Now listen carefully. The real reason why Bible expositors don't want to connect Daniel 8 with Daniel 9, do you know, most scholars refuse to see any connection between Daniel 8 and Daniel 9, even though we saw a clear connection. Point after point after point shows that there's a connection between Daniel 8 and Daniel 9. But most scholars don't want to connect Daniel 8 and 9, including many Adventist scholars. Do you know the reason why? It's very simple. If you apply the year-day principle to the 70 weeks, which is the first part of the 2300 days, you have to apply the year-day principle to the 2300 days as well. Are you following me or not? And if you do that, if you take the 70 weeks as applying the year-day principle, they're actually weeks, but they represent years. The 2300 days are the longer portion of which the 70 weeks are cut off. You would have to apply the year-day principle also to what? To the 2300 days. And have mercy, if you did that, you'd have to become a Seventh-day Adventist. According to what we're going to study in the next 2 lectures. There's no way around it. And that's the reason, the real reason why scholars don't really want to connect Daniel 8 with Daniel 9. They say that they're dealing with 2 different topics. It's impossible that they're dealing with 2 different topics. We've already noticed abundant evidence that these 2 chapters are actually very closely connected. Are you understanding my point?